October 15th, 1969. Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City lay quiet under the California twilight, shadows stretching long between weathered headstones and marble angels that seemed to watch over the departed, with stone eyes full of eternal compassion. The last of the mourners had driven away hours ago, their black Cadillacs and Lincolns disappearing into the Los Angeles evening like smoke dissipating into memory. Even the relentless press had finally given up their patient vigil outside the cemetery gates, satisfied with their photographs of America's most famous son standing stoically beside an open grave, grieving his father with the same composed dignity he brought to every public appearance. But Frank remained, unable to walk away from this final goodbye. He stood motionless beside the fresh grave, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored black overcoat, custom made on Savile Row, but feeling suddenly foreign against his skin. The October air carried the scent of eucalyptus and distant ocean salt, mixing with the earthen smell of newly turned soil and the lingering fragrance of funeral flowers that would wilt by morning, roses and carnations and lilies that meant nothing. Martin Sinatra's headstone stood simple and stark against the gathering darkness. No flowery epitaphs, no grand declarations of fame or achievement. Just a name carved in granite, two dates separated by a dash that contained an entire lifetime of dreams and struggles, and the simple, perfect word, Father. The cemetery's security guard, Eddie Torino, watched from behind a maintenance shed 50 yards away, his weathered hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee that had long since gone cold. He'd been specifically instructed by the funeral director to give Mr. Sinatra all the privacy he needed, but to stay close enough to ensure his safety in these uncertain times when public figures lived with constant threats. Eddie had worked these hallowed grounds for 12 years, had witnessed countless scenes of grief and farewell, had seen grown men crumble and strong women weep, but something about the way Frank stood there, so perfectly still, so utterly alone despite his worldwide fame, made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Frank's trembling fingers found the letter in his coat pocket, the paper soft and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times over the past 3 weeks. His father's handwriting, shaky but determined, written in the careful script of a man who'd learned English as a second language but mastered it with an immigrant's fierce pride. The letter had been written just 3 weeks before the massive stroke that took Martin away without warning, hidden in his desk drawer beneath old photographs and bank statements. Frankie, it began in that familiar, careful scrawl. I never told you this enough while I had the chance, but every single time I heard your voice on the radio, coming through that little Philco speaker in our kitchen while I was having my morning coffee, I remembered the little boy who used to sing me to sleep when the nightmares wouldn't let me rest. The memory hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak beneath the expensive fabric of his funeral suit. Suddenly he was 7 years old again, small and skinny and full of music he didn't yet understand, curled up beside his papa's worn leather chair in their cramped Hoboken apartment. His father would come home utterly exhausted from another brutal day at the shipyard, his calloused hands rough and stained with grease and the honest labor that paid their rent, his back aching from bending over machinery for 10 hours straight. The Depression had made work scarce and precious, and Martin Sinatra never took a single day for granted. But no matter how tired he was, no matter how his muscles screamed for rest, no matter how the bills piled up on the kitchen table, he'd always settle into that chair and ask for the same thing with gentle eyes that held all the tenderness he struggled to express in words. "Sing me that song, Frankie, the one your nonna taught you before she passed." Frank closed his eyes against the flood of memory and heard his grandmother's voice, warm and melodious, and thick with the Ligurian accent she'd carried across the Atlantic in steerage and never lost, not even after 40 years in America. Stella Stellina, the ancient Italian lullaby she'd brought from the old country like a treasured heirloom, passed down through generations of women who understood instinctively that sometimes the most powerful thing you could give someone was your voice in the darkness, a melody to chase away the loneliness and fear that crept in when the world went quiet and still. The wind picked up suddenly, rustling through the carefully maintained olive trees planted along the cemetery's eastern edge, their silver-green leaves whispering secrets in the gathering dusk, like souls sharing stories from beyond the veil. Frank looked around slowly, taking inventory of his solitude, with the precision of a man accustomed to being watched, analyzed, photographed at every moment. Eddie was there, at his respectful distance, a faithful shadow among shadows. But otherwise the world had gone completely quiet. No photographers hiding behind headstones with their clicking cameras. No reporters shouting questions about grief and loss. No audience of any kind demanding a performance from the voice, the legend, the chairman of the board. Just a son and his father's grave, alone with memories too precious to share with anyone. Frank pulled his hands from his pockets slowly and loosened the black silk tie that had been knotted perfectly for the funeral service by his valet. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were preparing for the most important performance of his life. Not for applause or acclaim, but for an audience of one who would never hear him sing again. When his voice finally came, it was barely a whisper, not the polished, powerful instrument that had filled concert halls and recording studios around the world. Not the smooth crooner's magic that had made him wealthy and famous beyond his wildest childhood imagination, but something infinitely more precious, something raw and unguarded and heartbreakingly honest. Starlit, night is approaching. The words floated across the cemetery like prayer made audible, soft as butterfly wings against the cooling air that carried them toward heaven. He sang without accompaniment, without amplification, without the sophisticated arrangements and orchestrations that had made him the most recognizable voice in popular music. This was the song exactly as his Nona had taught it to him 70 years ago on her deathbed, as he'd sung it to his papa during all those nights when sleep wouldn't come and bad dreams lurked in the corners, as his papa had hummed it unconsciously while shaving each morning for the past 60 years. Eddie found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own breathing might somehow intrude on this sacred moment unfolding before him. He'd heard Frank Sinatra sing on television, on the radio, on countless records that played in his own modest home. But this was something completely different, something that transcended entertainment or even art. This was a man stripping away every layer of fame and artifice and public persona, offering only what remained at his core, a son's perfect love, carried on notes that trembled with grief and memory and the terrible beauty of loss transformed into something eternal. Mommy's close to you. Frank's voice cracked slightly on the high note, cracking in exactly the same place it had cracked when he was 7 years old, and his voice hadn't yet changed, when he was just a skinny Italian kid from New Jersey with big dreams and an even bigger heart, singing to keep his papa's nightmares at bay. He didn't try to fix the imperfection, didn't clear his throat and start over the way he would have done in any recording studio. Instead, he let the crack stand, let it become part of the song, let it carry the weight of every goodbye he'd never been brave enough to say, every I love you that had gotten lost somewhere between fame and family. As he sang, tears began to fall, not the careful, composed tears of the funeral service, when hundreds of eyes had been watching his every expression, but the raw, uncontrolled sorrow of a man who had just lost the one person on earth who remembered him before he became Frank Sinatra. His father had called him Frankie until the day he died, had never stopped seeing him as the scrappy, determined kid from Hoboken who sang for supper money on street corners. Sleep, sleep, oh baby, your mom's close like that. The lullaby was ending, but Frank couldn't bear to stop singing. He started it again from the beginning, the way his papa used to ask him to do during those long nights when insomnia and immigrant worries made sleep impossible. 3 times, sometimes 4, Frank would sing it, his young voice growing softer until the old man's breathing would slow and his weathered face would finally relax into peace. Eddie wiped his own eyes with the back of his hand, not caring that tears had begun streaming down his cheeks. In 12 years of working cemetery security detail, through thousands of burials and farewells, he had never witnessed anything remotely like this moment. He understood that he was watching something sacred unfold, not a performance designed for applause, but an ancient ritual as old as love itself, as timeless as the bond between fathers and sons. When Frank finally fell silent, the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic on the San Diego freeway and the soft whisper of wind through leaves that rustled like whispered prayers. He reached slowly into his other coat pocket and pulled out something small and precious, a tarnished silver medal that his father had worn every single day for 40 years, Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers and those far from home. He placed it gently on the fresh dirt of the grave, right beside the headstone, where moonlight made the carved letters seem to glow. "Thank you, Papa," he whispered, his voice so quiet that even Eddie had to strain to hear it. "For everything you gave me, for every song, for every dream, for teaching me that love sounds like music when you sing it with your whole heart." Frank stood there for another 10 minutes in complete silence, saying goodbye to the man who had given him not just life, but the courage to use his voice when the world seemed too big and too frightening to navigate alone. Then he turned slowly and walked toward the cemetery gates, his footsteps soft as secrets on the gravel path that wound between sleeping stones. Eddie waited until Frank's black limousine had disappeared into the night before emerging from behind the maintenance shed and approaching the grave with hat in hand. The St. Christopher medal glinted in the last light of day, and he could swear he still heard the echo of that ancient lullaby hanging in the air like incense, like a prayer that would never end. The next morning, entertainment reporters would write about Frank Sinatra's dignified handling of his father's funeral, about the star-studded service and the elaborate floral arrangements from celebrities around the world. But they would never know about the 4 minutes that mattered most, when the legend became just a son again, singing the song that had connected 3 generations of Sinatra men, proving that the most important performances happen when there's no one left to impress except the dead and the angels who remember every lullaby ever sung in perfect love. That night, the voice didn't matter, the heart did. Sometimes the most profound moments happen not on stages filled with screaming fans or in recording studios with perfect acoustics, but in quiet places where love speaks louder than fame. Frank Sinatra discovered this truth beside his father's grave, where a son became more important than a star, where an ancient lullaby carried more power than any hit, where the only audience that mattered was one who would never applaud again, but whose memory would echo through every note Frank would sing for rest of day.